हाँ जी.
Am I audible? Oh yes, now I'm sure I'm audible to everyone. Okay. Very nice. So the first is to glean information about feelings and intentions of people, right? So I have already explained this point. The second is to regulate interactions. Now when you're talking to somebody, you can somehow through your non-verbal behavior start a conversation, or you get to know when they are not, other person is not interested in talking, or when the person wants to end the conversation. So somehow through your non-verbal gestures, you can either initiate a conversation, you can continue the conversation, or you can put an end to an interaction. So non-verbal behavior helps us regulating interactions. Now a lot of times we can use non-verbal communication to express intimacy. You might not have exact words to console somebody, but when in distress, giving somebody just a hug or a pat in the back communicates much more. So a lot of time non-verbal behavior helps you communicate intimacy or express intimacy that we might not be able to do verbally. Now another thing is that non-verbal communication also helps to assert dominance and control. The way we stand, the way we act makes us assume more power or control in a given situation. Right? Lastly, non-verbal communication can also help us in goal attainment. For example, if I need something, I can just point at that direction. And you will understand, maybe, ma'am is pointing here, she might need water. So my goal is to get the water from her, and just a simple act of pointing can get me that. So these are the various functions of non-verbal your communication, which includes getting information about a person's intention and feelings, expressing intimacy, regulating interactions, facilitating goal attainment, as well as establishing a sense of dominance and control. Right? Now we'll move on to gender differences in non-verbal communication. What do you think are the gender differences between, of course, men and women when it comes to knowledge, use and recognition of non-verbal cues? Who is better?
Women are better, I think.
Prachi says women are better. Neer says men are better. Okay. In reality, research suggests that women tend to be much better than men when it comes to recognizing visual and auditory cues. Now, the reason for this difference is not biological or evolutionary. Rather, the difference is social, and it can be tied to the fact that even since childhood, women are taught to pay more attention to people's feelings and expressions. As a child itself, women and girls are taught that it is your duty to cater to people's feelings and pay attention to their expressions, that men are not socialized. Another thing is child rearing practices. Now women are mostly the caretaker of kids. Kids cannot speak. A lot of times you are the one inferring what the kid wants through non-verbal gestures. In fact, research has found that not only are women more perceptive when it comes to understanding various auditory and visual cues, in fact, they also have better knowledge of various non-verbal cues. There is something called TONC test, or it is called TONC, test of non-verbal communication knowledge. Wait. मेरे बैग से एक दे दो मुझे पेन आ गई होगा थैंक यू TONC TONC test of non-verbal communication knowledge, and we found that women tend to do much better in this test than men, which means that they have better knowledge of non-verbal cues. Moreover, when people are asked to depict certain emotions like empathy, women tend to be more accurate in reporting or enacting empathy as compared to men. And this was found by William Eckes. William Eckes. Tongue test was given by Janelle Rosip and Judith Hall. So when it comes to gender differences, we now have evidence that women tend to be better at auditory and visual cues as compared to men. Secondly, we know that the difference is not biological or evolutionary, rather it is social. Third, we know that when it comes to tongue test, knowledge of non-verbal cues is much better in women. Fourthly, through a meta-analysis done by William X, we found that women tend to be more accurate in terms of responding and recognizing and enacting a certain emotion as compared to men. For example, what he did was he did a study in which women thought that they were evaluated for their empathy, and during that study he found that women were more accurate in displaying various cues of empathy as compared to men. So this is about gender differences. Now we'll move to relationship and attachment. So when it comes to relationship and attachment, two people who are in an intimate relationship with each other tend to have better and more accurate understanding of each other's non-verbal cues. Of course, people who know each other well should be able to understand their non-verbal cues also. People actually thought that there might be a relationship between parent-child interaction also, depending upon their attachment style. However, research till now has not found any significant difference between parent and child's attachment style and the understanding of non-verbal cues, and a lot of research in this domain is yet to be done. Okay. Now coming to the most obvious non-verbal cue, facial expressions, right? So till date, a lot of studies have focused on how facial expressions can help us communicate different emotions and how different emotions are communicated through different facial expressions. So it was Darwin who initially started working on emotions, and he found that there are small number of emotions, and all these emotions are actually associated with some universal facial expression. For example, if I ask you, say Manya, show surprise. So can you notice what she's showing? Okay, can somebody stand and show surprise to everyone? So what is happening here? Eyebrows gets raised, jaw gets dropped. These are facial expressions related to the emotion of surprise. Similarly, if I ask somebody to say display anger, Anmol, can you display anger to everybody? No, he cannot experience anger. Akash can show anger. Just show anger. Okay, when you show anger, what happens? I did not expect you to shout. Facial expression of anger you were supposed to show. So when you show anger, your eyebrows get squinted. You'll experience some wrinkles around your forehead. Your lower eyelid and upper eyelid will again become more. No, it will become raised. You will open your eyes even more to just let all the information in. So there are certain facial expressions that are associated with emotions. One can easily recognize the emotion through facial expressions. It was Paul Ekman who identified 6 basic emotions. What are the 6 basic emotions? Inside out देखिए.
Yes, ma'am, देखिए अच्छी है.
Happiness,
Embarrassment,
sadness, fear,
disgust,
disgust,
anger,
anger, yes. One is left.
embarrassment,
Surprise. So happiness, sadness, surprise, fear, anger and disgust are 6 primarily basic emotions. All these emotions, all these basic emotions, in fact even other emotions are associated with distinct pattern of facial muscle activity. Now when I talk about raised eyebrows or if I talk about jaws being dropped, all these are linked to distinct muscle activities that are happening in your face. So by just observing what is the muscle activity that is happening in your face through your expressions, one can make out the emotions. In fact, there was a study done by Paul Ekman in which he took pictures of various people demonstrating various different emotions. And he circulated those photographs to various people and those people were asked to identify the emotion that the photograph showed. And he found that universally, most people were able to identify the emotions very accurately, which means there are no cultural differences as such when it comes to recognition of facial expression. Facial expression with respect to emotions are fairly universal and have some evolutionary roots. How did we find that they have evolutionary roots? Firstly, people across every culture was able to identify which emotion was that. Secondly, there was another research done on comparing emotions experienced by humans and the expressions or emotions experienced by animals, and we found animals like chimpanzees also tend to give the same facial muscle activity or same facial expressions when they're experiencing some emotions. Thirdly, if you look at newborns, toddlers, they smile when they are happy, they cry when they are sad, they yell when they are angry. Till date, they have not grown enough to get socialized in terms of how to display these emotions. But they are also displaying similar pattern of emotions through their facial expressions. What does this mean? That all these expressions have some biological roots rather than socialized. Okay. Later, Paul Ekman actually found that people across Western cultures, across Latin cultures, Asian cultures, as well as Indo-European cultures, all of them tended to be accurate in identifying these 6 basic emotions. Interestingly, there was another study that was done by Paul Ekman. So the first study that he did was he showed photographs of people displaying various emotions and found that people were able to accurately describe which emotion they were seeing. Then he found that maybe this study has some criticism that here people were asked to pose certain emotions. So these all pictures are of emotions being posed than actually naturally expressed emotions. So then he repeated another study in which he took various visual representations or videos of soap operas, and he asked people to look at those videos of different soap operas and identify the emotion that they are experiencing through their expressions. Again, he got the results where people were mostly accurate when it comes to identifying the emotions. Okay. Based upon this, Paul Ekman developed something called facial action coding system. I will write it here. Facial action coding system. It is also called FACS. So this is a standard measure to measure the facial movement based upon small unit of muscle activity that might reflect an underlying emotional state. तो एक एक छोटा छोटा आपका जो मसल एक्टिविटी होता है फेस में, उसको वो सिस्टमैटिकली रिकॉर्ड कर देता है और देखता है कि कौन से इमोशंस के साथ कौन कौन सी मसल एक्टिविटीज़ हो रही हैं. ये फेशियल एक्शन कोडिंग सिस्टम बनाया था. And yes, specifically this technique was developed to be able to measure the emotions experienced by chimpanzees, because we wanted to establish whether the way chimpanzees express different emotions on their faces are similar to that of humans. Specifically for that, this facial action coding system was generated. So now we have understood that facial expressions are tied to different emotions, and through looking at facial expressions we can understand what are the various emotions that they might be facing. For example, Prachi might say that ma'am, you are very nice, but her face says something else. So I can understand that. Next example अच्छा होगा. So now we'll come to facial display rules. Every culture and situation dictates how you are supposed to express your emotions facially. For example, right now we are sitting in a class. Even if you are bored, the class situation does not permit you to express that boredom or sleepiness on your face. Culturally, we belong to India, where there is higher power distance. So if a teacher is standing here, you might want to hide that yawn or that boredom on your face. But imagine you are a Gen Z student in an American high school. You are sitting laid back, not caring what the teacher thinks. How are you going to display your actual emotion gets influenced by the culture and the situation that you are now in. Again, if you are at home, you are very bored, you will express your boredom, but maybe not in that class. Because the culture and situation are going to dictate how you are allowed to express your emotions. In fact, there are cultural differences in the way people recognize and experience emotions as well. There was a study done to understand cultural differences in recognizing and decoding information, and they found that people who belong to the same ethnic group tend to be much more accurate at identifying emotions in people who belong to that same ethnic group. But if somebody belongs to a different ethnic group, they might not be that accurate in identifying their emotions. So if you come from the same ethnic group, you are more likely to be more accurate in identifying the facial expressions. Another very interesting study was done between Americans and Japanese. So both American and Japanese students were shown a very stressful film, which led to experience of very negative emotions, right? Then after they saw this film, both American and Japanese students were taken to different rooms and they were asked about their opinions of that film. They found that when it came to private expression of their viewpoints, both American and Japanese students accurately displayed their negative emotions when we were discussing in private with maybe one person or two people. But when they were asked to publicly express how they felt about the movie, American students did display similar emotions, similar facial expressions, similar display rules, but Japanese tended to conceal the negative emotion that they experienced while they were watching that film. This is because culturally, Japan or Japanese culture prohibits expression of negative emotion publicly. Therefore, they tend to conceal the negative emotions. But if you look at the emotions that they express in private, both Japanese and American students express that emotion. So, experience of emotion was similar across both the groups. Expression in private was similar, but expression in public was different, because culturally the display rules do not allow them to display negative emotions. Through this, we again understand that display rules have an impact on cultural rules have an impact on how we display certain emotions. Moreover, these display rules are actually a lot of time accompaniments to your language and other form of communication. Right? So you might speak something, and along with that you might use facial display rules as an addition. So your facial movements tend to add or accompany various other forms of communication including language. Now coming to the most effective means of non-verbal communication, which gives you the most amount of information. What is that non-verbal information? Can you guess? Gaze or eye contact. What is gaze? Gaze is whether when you look at somebody else for a prolonged period of time, or maintaining eye contact is actually which is one of the most information rich source of non-verbal behavior. Through just your gaze, people can infer your feelings, your credibility, your honesty, competence as well as attentiveness. Right? वो बोलते हैं ना कभी कभी हिंदी मूवीज में आंखों में देखकर बताओ, because you want to test honesty. Now if I maintain eye contact with you while I am talking about my subject, which means she knows what she is talking, it displays competence. Now if I look at various students, and some students will directly look at me in my eye, and some students would not, it will indicate their attentiveness towards what I am teaching. So whether it is your honesty, true feelings, attentiveness, competence, everything, you can get some information through the gaze. Moreover, eye contact itself can signal sometimes intimacy. Research has found that if a gaze is mutual, people feel that there is higher amount of intimacy. To the extent that even if I give you false information about a person gazing at you, you are more likely to like that person had I not given you the false information. When you feel that other person is looking at you, you automatically end up liking the person more. This is the impact of gaze, but of course it is context dependent. Don't assume that context has no role to play. If you are walking on the street and a stalker gives you that creepy look or gaze, it will make you feel embarrassed and uncomfortable. It will not lead to greater liking. So therefore, keep this contextual information also in place while interpreting the results of gaze and intimacy. Gaze also plays a very important role in communicating status and control. The person who gazes confidently tends to also express that they assume higher status and they are more in control. This is actually demonstrated through something called visual dominance behavior, where a speaker who has the tendency to gaze at a lower level speaker or a lower status speaker. People who were listening to somebody who was gazing at a lower status individual, they tended to assume that the speaker who is gazing tends to be more competent and superior and has greater power. In fact, leaders who gazed at lower status individuals were perceived as having better leadership traits as compared to those who were not gazing. This is called visual dominance behavior. That is a tendency to gaze fixedly at a lower status speaker leads to a perception of the speaker having more positive traits. Can happen only through simple thing as gaze. Now we'll discuss gaze with respect to gender. Very good, you identified. So yes, so basically here we are going to talk about three dynamics. One is of course gender. Okay. The other is power. I would call it power, but in reality the power that we are talking about here is the expertise. And third thing that we are looking at is gaze. So there was a research done by Jack Dovidio Jack, JackDovidio, in, okay, year is not mentioned. So what he did was he wanted to study the role of power in gender related differences in gaze. What he made was he took pairs of mixed genders, one woman and one man, gave them a topic of discussion. Now how these pairs were made is also very important. There were three conditions. In the first condition, the man had the expertise with respect to that topic. The woman did not. Right? In the second pair, a second condition, the woman had the expertise in that topic, but the man did not. And in the third pair, both women and man had equal level of expertise with respect to the topic being discussed. What do you think would have been the results? We are wanting to see who gazes more in these three scenarios.
मेरे ख्याल से आदमी ही तीनों सिचुएशन में ज़्यादा फेस करेगा. मेरा ऐसा ख्याल है, गलत भी हो सकता है, क्योंकि चुप हो जाए, क्योंकि पेट्रियार्की के हिसाब से अगर हम उसमें देखें तो औरतों को इतना ऐसा आई कॉन्टैक्ट करना सिखाया नहीं गया है कि आप.
So interestingly, we found that in the condition of expertise or power, the person who had greater expertise tended to gaze more. So in the condition when women had the power and men did not, power in terms of expertise, women gazed more. But when both of them had equal expertise, then gender differences come into play where men tend to gaze more than women, and women would assume a more low status position through their body language than men in the group when both the genders had equal expertise. जब एक्सपर्टीज होगी आपके पास तो आप गेज करेंगे, क्योंकि दूसरे के पास एक्सपर्टीज नहीं है और आप यू विल डिस्प्ले मोर पावर एंड कंट्रोल. बट व्हेन बोथ द इंडिविजुअल्स हैव इक्वल एक्सपर्टीज, men tend to dominate more than women, where women tend to assume a more low status position. Now do you think that cultural differences also in gaze? So in any interaction, gaze has to be mutual, especially in situations where you are addressing a crowd. Right now I am addressing all of you. So research ने भी ये बताया है that when we are speaking, Americans tends to gaze more when they are speaking than when they are listening. Americans tend to gaze more when they are listening than when they are speaking. So Americans tend to gaze 71% of the time when they are listening, rather when they are speaking they will only gaze 41% of the time. It's because when you are listening all your attention is towards me, you are looking at me, but when I am talking I look at somebody, I look at the wall, I look at the fan, I look outside. So as a speaker your gaze reduces, but as a listener your gaze increases. This is especially true for Americans. On the other hand, for African American, there is a difference. France and Mayo found that for African Americans, I'll write the spelling, France and Mayo, 1976, they found that in case of African Americans, they tend to gaze much more when they are speaking than when they are listening. So when they are listening, they are likely to be distracted, will look here and there, but they are listening. But when they are speaking, they gaze almost 70%. Now imagine how does this play in a cross-cultural scenario where imagine there is an American speaker who is speaking and the audience consists of say 50 to 60% African American. An American speaker who is used to having 75% gaze while speaking, people are listening to him. Now it is addressing a crowd of American and Africans who are not giving him that gaze. He is going to perceive them as being inattentive and not listening. So this is how cultural differences all in gaze can actually play a role. Okay, from gaze now we'll move to postures and gestures. Time है?
मैम 15 मिनट है 144 हो रहा है.
No, we have 15 minutes, we will cover. Postures and gestures. How do posture and gestures signify something? Some amount of information we already get through postures. Now, interesting thing about gestures that I'm going to talk about are emblems. Every culture uses some form of emblem to signify something. What does this mean? Hi or bye in our culture. Not every culture would see a wave sign as some similar thing. For example, we use this sign to say that what you have done is very good. In some culture, it is actually offensive and is used as a slang. Okay sign is seen as a slang in a lot of culture and it is very derogatory to use that. So there are cultural differences when it comes to the use of gestures and postures also. Specifically certain kinds of emblems. There are some emblems of course that are easily and well understood universally, but some emblems tend to be very confusing also because there tends to be culture specific. For example, in Western culture, if I want to point to self, if I want to talk about self, I am more likely to put hand on my chest and say this is what I am talking about myself. But on the other hand, Japanese culture, they point to their nose when they are referring to their self instead of their chest. So if somebody is not accustomed to Japanese culture and they see somebody touching their nose or pointing to their nose, they might not understand that they are actually referring to self. This is a culture specific emblem or a gesture. Moreover, in India, how do we say yes? In Britain, actually, a sideway nod it actually means a no. Yes. So the way we nod might be actually confusing because the way we say yes in India means no in Turkey and a sideway nod like this means no in Britain. So these gestures are actually very confusing. For example, in Britain we invite people to approach by an upturned finger. If you want to call somebody in Britain, you are going to call like this, upturned finger and one finger here. But in India, if you want to call somebody, you will have downturned fingers and one finger pointed upwards. So you are just this we might feel offensive, whatever are they calling us like this. So your gestures and emblems are very culture specific and they might be perceived very differently in different cultures. So it's best when you're talking to somebody belonging to a different culture to refrain from using some gestures and emblems because it can mean anything. Coming to body language. So body language can speak much more than spoken language can. We all have observed. And one thing that body language communicates very easily is, guess, relative status of an individual. Through one's body language, one is easily able to communicate the status that they are assuming in relation to the other person. No. The way a person stands around, the way a high status individual will stand around somebody belonging to low status will change. Their body language will change. Where a low status individual will be more cautious, will try to maintain more distance, will have more of a bent body language. On the other hand, the high status individual will feel free to take up the space. They look and appear more confident. Their head would be higher. So through these ways, body language can actually communicate relative status of people when they are interacting to a group of people. Like for example, in a study done by Larissa, where should I write it? If I write it here, you'll be able to see? Okay. Larissa Tidens and Alison Fragile in 2003. They found that high status or dominant people took up more space by adopting a more expansive posture. On the other hand, people who were low status tended to occupy less space, did not have a very expansive posture. Along with that, people who were of high status appeared more relaxed, they appeared more open, their arms and legs were akimbo and they had a backward lean to their body. Backward lean to their body along with taking more space, having a more expansive posture where you look more relaxed, more open, and your arms and legs are in akimbo. Akimbo. Google. What does akimbo mean?
मैम यहाँ ना नेटवर्क नहीं आता, मैं क्या दो के रह जाती हूँ.
Those who are at lower status tend to assume a posture that is complementary to the high status individual, which means they take up less space, they take a more constrictive posture with arms and legs and the torso all curved inwards. So whether you're taking a more expansive outwards facing posture or inwards, that is the difference. What is the time? Can we start with touch?
Yes मैम, क्यों नहीं 50.
10 minutes left.
50 हो रहा है.
Okay. So Jones and Yarbrough came up with 5 categories of touch. Now we are doing touch. We're studying touch. We're not doing touch. We are studying touch, and these are the names of author: Jones and Yarbrough. 1985. He came with 5 categories of touch. The first is positive affect. You touch to communicate positive affect in terms of communicating appreciation, communicating affection, reassurance, nurturance, or sexual interest. All these will include positive affect touches. Then there is playful touch that just happened between the two of them to communicate humor and playfulness, where he just touched her on her head in a way wanting to slap her. That is playful touch. Then there is control. Control is to draw attention or to induce compliance. Control. Are you saying कैसे touch करेंगे for control and compliance? Come stand here. Control and compliance touch. Ritualistic touch. To satisfy ritualistic requirements, जैसे कि आप पैर छूते हो किसी का, या आप you shake hands. So that is a way of that is a form of ritualistic touch. And then there is task related touch. To accomplish a certain task, for example, a nurse will be touching your wrist to take the pulse reading, or a violin teacher will have to touch a student's head to position the head in the right manner, or if you're learning dancing, the teacher will correct your position. So all this is oriented to getting a certain task fulfilled. So these are 5 forms of touch for specific purposes, starting from positive affect, playfulness. Yes. First one is positive affect, which is to communicate appreciation, to communicate reassurance, to communicate nurturance as well as sexual interest. So a mother patting the baby for doing a good job, positive affect. Alright. Or a coach patting the back of their students for a good performance becomes positive affect. Playful, we have seen. Control, I have showed. And ritualistic, we all understand in India we have a lot of ritualistic touches and task related touch. There are 2 more additions, which is negative affect. Negative affect touch would be something like
एक झापड़ कर दो।
she gets annoyed by being touched by a strange man and she tries to pull herself away or shake his hands off. Negative affect. धक्का मार देना, negative affect. Or a person slaps the other one. Negative affect touch. Actually, slapping would come under the seventh form of touch, which is aggressive touch, which would be slapping, kicking, or punching. Now I've told you so many touches. Negative, avoid negative touch and aggressive touch. The other 5 are okay. Now can we discuss gender differences in touch?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you have a question? Tell me if you have a question. So men touch women more often than women touch men.
Yes, ma'am. True.
Very obvious. We all know. Gender differences in touch, where men touch women more than women touch men. And people are more likely to touch members of opposite sex than the same sex. Ask Henley, 1973, who said this. Women derive greater pleasure from being touched than men, but the circumstances of the touch have to be very important, right? When I say women derive greater pleasure on being touched than men, it doesn't mean that you're walking down the street and a random man touches you and the person is going to be happy about it. Circumstances and context here is very important. Maybe if a woman is being pat on her back for a good performance, she is going to derive greater pleasure for that affection than a man would. So this is what we are trying to communicate, not anything otherwise. Okay, now coming to cultural differences. There is substantial variation in the amount of actual touch used by people belonging to different cultures. For example, people who are Latin American or Mediterranean or Arabs, they tend to touch each other much more and they like touching and being touched. On the other hand, Northern European people belonging to North America, Australia or Asia, they do not like being touched and they don't have a culture of touching each other.
फिर मैं वो touch deprived भी तो हो जाती है।
It's not that they don't like being touched at all. I am sure with respect to their partners, they are happy being touched. But I am talking about in general scenario where you will see, if you see two Arabs meeting each other, they greet each other by hugging each other, giving each other big hugs, patting the back. That's the gesture in which they meet each other. On the other hand, Northern Europeans or Americans would refrain from such a warm embrace. All that they'll do is a handshake or just a side hug. Okay, so from that perspective. Now let's wrap up this entire section by discussing the last topic, which is personal space. So the theory of personal space was given by the anthropologist Akash. सुन लो यार, तुम तो सुनने वाले बच्चे हो, तुम कैसे भी attention पे कर रहे? So anthropologist Edward Hall. Edward Hall in 1966. आप लोगों ने पढ़ी है ये पहले थ्योरी एडवर्ड हॉल की पर्सनल स्पेस की, तो पढ़ी होगी ना? हाँ. So he talks about 4 forms. अब भी जाइए, आप नहीं आए तो मैं याद दिला देती हूँ, आपको जरूरत नहीं है. हाँ. So there are 4 interpersonal distance zone. These are mainly found in United States. हम लोग US का डेटा कंसिडर कर रहे हैं, बाकी कल्चर का नहीं कर रहे हैं. 4 interpersonal zones होते हैं. पहला आता है हमारा intimate distance. Intimate distance is a distance that you share with people who are very close to you, who are your close friends, parents, partners, etc. This distance is up to half a meter. Half a meter, you are comfortable with them standing in your space. Rather, if your close friend is standing like a meter apart, you will be like, इतना दूर क्यों खड़ा है? So that is the amount of distance that we are okay with when it comes to the intimate relationships. Here you get cues such as the sight, sound, smell, body temperature, depth and pace of breathing. So if somebody is standing just half a distance away from you, you will be able to get all these cues. This is intimate distance. So that's what people talk about while applying perfume. If you are applying perfume, let a person be in the intimate distance to be able to smell the fragrance. Then personal distance. Now personal distance is from half a meter to 1.25 meter. So this is a transition area between intimate contact and formal behavior. Right? So basically in Western countries, for everyday interaction with friends and acquaintances, this personal distance is the appropriate distance. So for acquaintances, for business meetings, so not for business meetings, for your colleagues, etc. For co-workers, you are going to use the personal distance. Here you can get cues such as effects of body temperature, smell and breathing. All these cues greatly get reduced because up the person becomes almost a meter away. Then there is something called social distance. Social distance is 1.25 meters to 4 meters. So this is typically when there is a casual or a business interaction that is taking place. Here many more cues are lost, but verbal contact is easily maintained. Usually the furniture arrangement is such that it helps us get that amount of distance. So there will be a huge round table in the center along with people who would be sitting. This would enable you to get that level of distance. The last is public distance. Public distance is 4 to 8 meters. Ideally this should be the distance between me and you people, but because of lack of space we hardly have 2 meter difference. So it is that amount of distance that is required when somebody is speaking in public and addressing a crowd, be it taking lectures or a celebrity giving a press conference. So here इतना डिस्टर्बिंग यार, आप लोगों में कोई रिस्पेक्ट नहीं है टीचर या अथॉरिटी की, कुछ है ही नहीं.
मैं आपको ये कहने वाली थी कि स्कूल में ये चीजें नहीं होती कि आप उठ के चले जाओ, कॉलेज में.
So in lecture halls, lectures are usually placed around 3.5 meters back, and this similar space is also practiced in courtrooms. So your intimate distance, personal distance, social distance and public distance, 4 levels of differences. Now when it comes to personal space, there are of course huge differences between two individuals, between people belonging to different age. People belonging to different age are comfortable with different kind of distances. Of course, gender and culture. This is the norm in American or US culture. This distance, interpersonal difference greatly reduces when we take into account the Indian culture. Here the intimate distance becomes much closer, public distance also becomes much closer. So the concept of interpersonal space varies from culture to culture, gender to gender, age to age and between individual also. There are some people who find the idea of somebody invading their personal space very uncomfortable, while other might stick to the other person when they are standing in a queue. Happens, right? When you are standing in a queue, the other person would actually be touching your back. Some people would not like it and say, can you just move away, it's invading my space. These cross-cultural differences in the way we perceive space can actually be observed when people from Asian countries go abroad and people from Western countries go to India, and they start feeling somehow that the personal space is being invaded. Because in India, our personal space that we need is much lower than Westerners do. Might be because of high population density. We can't really afford that much personal space because of highly dense population. So with this we have covered language and communication, and in the next class we will touch upon cultural features. Communication. The name of the topic is locating culture in language, something like this. So you can check out your lesson plan, you will get to know.